Our next presenter is Janine McGowan, freelance scientist. Janine McGowan is an avid apiculturalist with over 6 years experience at the University of Guelph Honeybee Research Center. She got her master's in environmental biology, designing 3 laboratory protocols for diagnosing honeybee diseases. A wealth of information and enthusiasm, Janine will be happy to spend the evening discussing anything bee, with emphasis on general beekeeping practices. Janine is also ready and willing to discuss the preservation of native pollinators and their habitat. So the way it's going to work is it's just a straight Q&A since we're running a little bit low on time. So if you could please join me in welcoming Janine McGowan.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone drives home safely this evening. Okay, so I guess it's just, I'm just more than willing to answer. I'm not necessarily expecting anyone to know too much about like beekeeping in its own regard, but if you guys have any questions about what you've heard say about honeybees or just native pollinators in the general media, or if you have any questions, I mean, I'll do my best to answer them.
Janine, can you give us an update on the nicotinoid issue and where things rest with that presently?
Okay, so as it stands, and this is all, it's a bit of a disclaimer. As a scientist, I try to be unbiased, so I really don't have any invested interest on the other side. Well, my invested interest would be for the fact that it would be kind of resolved in such a way where both farmers and native pollinators would be able to benefit. So, as we all understand, neonicotinoids were really, really good pesticide for farmers to use to coat their grain seed, particularly. And I guess there's been several countries, such as France, that have banned the use of neonicotinoids. Whether or not there's been strong scientific evidence as to whether or not there's been significant bounce back in pollinators is yet to be determined. But what is going on here, at least in Canada, is that I believe, from what I understand, there's kind of still 2 divided camps with regards to what Ontario farmers believe and then certain beekeeping associations. So the latest update from what I've been trying to read about is that there's a really dangerous synergistic effect between neonicotinoids and other pesticides like Maxim Quattro, which is a fungicide. And unfortunately, when the neonicotinoids were being tested on bees, they, in their own regard, actually didn't cause significant damage. But it is when the bees encounter other types of pesticides, such as this fungicide, that it actually causes significant problems. Am I talking too fast?
Janine, what would be the top things that you would recommend for landowners, farm owners to integrate into their farming systems to help bees or native pollinators? What are the top recommendations you would make?
Right, so if you were able to allow like the land in and around, say, any like river access, like if you were able to allow the land to kind of reclaim itself, especially in around the rivers, the plants that grow there will definitely be able to support, especially native pollinators. There are other practices that you can do, like not cut your grass so much. I know that's bad for mosquitoes, but longer grass and things like clover, like trying to diversify, say, what you have in your front lawn, trying to maybe introduce clover to your front lawn would be definitely beneficial. And then, of course, letting those dandelions grow. Dandelions are a really, really good food source at the beginning of spring for so many animals, pollinators, rabbits, even birds. So yeah, just kind of letting things go a little wild. And then, of course, if you do want to plant seeds, make sure that they're not covered in pesticides. So try to get them, say, organic or from places like William Dam who don't use seed coating. Probably be pretty good for them.
What is the optimum temperature that bees normally like to do work at for pollinating in, say, a field of red clover?
Right. So actually, red clover, the nectar channels in red clover are actually really quite deep, and honeybee tongues are not quite long enough to actually access the nectar sources. So if you wanted to grow clover for, as a green kind of fertilizer for your field, I would strongly recommend white Dutch or Elsiki clover, because then what you can do then is invite a beekeeper to bring their hives or actually get your own hives. And while that land is kind of, rebalancing itself and fixating nitrogen, you could then actually get a boost in your, say, clover honey. So that actually, you could sell that and maybe make some money selling the white clover honey. But the optimal temperature when red clover is, I guess, growing and then bees are out in the field, honeybees optimally, they actually have to keep their hives at 35 degrees Celsius. So when it's really, really hot, the honeybees work really hard at actually collecting water to cool their hive and keep it well ventilated. So I guess, all I really want to say is like a summer like this summer, where it rained continuously and constantly and really, really hard. The general consensus from what I've heard from my fellow beekeepers, is that it was actually fairly hard on the bees this year, because when it rains, the rain actually washes away a lot of the nectar from the flowers. And then, of course, with really hard rain, it actually damages the flowers. So I'm kind of anticipating the honey crop to be fairly low comparatively this year. Did that answer the question, hopefully?
A couple of years ago, we heard a lot about pollinator patches. I was wondering if naturalizing areas is better, or if there's a golden position where you maybe have a naturalized area and then augment it with pollinator patches. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Okay, so that's a really good question. They've all been really great questions. So you think about a fallow field, and the plants themselves have kind of, figured out when, they've learned how to share resources, and they kind of figure out where and when to grow. So there's a lot of kind of successional growing, I guess, that happens, right? Like as you see, like you get your dandelions in the spring, and then you get your goldenrod in the fall. Everything kind of blooms sequentially, which is really, really beneficial to pollinators, as it provides a continuous source of food. So naturalized areas tend to, kind of take their turns in such a way. So if you wanted to go out and get some seed, definitely, I think, you save yourself some time and actually get a perennial seed so that it can continue coming back. And then, of course, like if you so wanted to grow, sunflowers, and then keep those seeds for the next season. Bees love sunflowers, but there's nothing better than, dandelion and aster and goldenrod and clover and, wild apple trees and everything. So, yeah, there's tons of lists of, gardening for bees, and all the flowers that you can get. But yeah, I'd strongly encourage, if you were to do that, to get perennials. Sure.
My question is, what's the distance that the bees travel for the pollen or the honey, to make the honey, for native and for the hives?
Okay, so if I think I heard that question, it was what distance can they travel to get their resources? Is that correct? Is it a distance question? Okay. So, every native pollinator is different. There's solitary bees. There are social bees. So social bees are honeybees and bumblebees. And so, the only real bees that we actually, keep for ourselves are honeybees. There are mason bees and alfalfa, like leaf cutter bees, but they're kind of just brought in and then disposed of generally at the end of the season. So I will be discussing more the domesticated honeybee, which actually has been studied to be able to navigate up to a radius of 3 kilometers, which is fairly significant. If you think about how small a bee actually is, like I'd love to actually do the distance kind of to our size ratio, because it would be like us being able to navigate to Toronto and back. You know, it's very remarkable. It's very very kind of just amazing, really. So when you think about maybe inviting a beekeeper or putting your bees down in your area, just like make sure that you can access them, meaning if you're going to have bees, the honey is going to start to pile up in these boxes called honey supers. And I mean, the large honey supers can weigh up to 80 to 90 pounds. And so you don't want to be dragging those big honey boxes back out through the bush. So you want to be able to drive up to your bees. But yeah, I guess another thing too, I guess I could recommend is if you actually are trying or thinking about getting your own bees and you're taking a look at your land, water is essential, especially, as I mentioned in the summertime where honeybees actually need water to keep their hives air conditioned. So water is essential. And then, of course, if you can maybe take a look around and see what types of things are already growing on your land, and if there's, say, a successional food source for them to forage on would also be very advantageous. A third thing definitely to consider is whether or not your neighbors have beehives and how many. So a general rule of thumb is that a honeybee yard really has no more than 30 to 40 of those boxes that you see. Those are called colonies. So anything more than, say, 40 colonies in one site, aka a 3-kilometer radius, anything more than that can really put a strain on the honeybees themselves because they're actually competing for resources. And then, of course, too many honeybees can really put a strain on the native pollinators as well. If they are just occupying too many dandelions, and the bumblebees don't get a chance to get their spring boost so that they can develop throughout the summer, then it really does put a strain on everybody. Okay.
Hello. After you brought up the red clover not being suitable for the bees, it got me thinking. So we do green manure crops along with underseeding our corn and beans, which is kind of a cocktail mix. Is there a certain cocktail mix that you recommend to help with the succession of available pollen? And just helping farmers to plant the right crops when they're trying to get fodder or a green manure crop into their rotation. Thanks.
Right, that's also a really good question. So from the research that I have done and the conversations that I've had with farmers, my father is a farmer. He's got 500 acres himself, and so one of the crops that he actually puts down apart from Alsiki is buckwheat. And so buckwheat is just it's really good, right, for green manure. And then, of course, the abundance in buckwheat honey that you can get from a really good growing year, you're up to your eyeballs in buckwheat honey. And honestly, it's considered probably a fairly, it's a commodity honey, I guess. So you can usually sell it for a larger price than, your normal honey. So again, it's just, for me, my dad and I, we really do benefit, say, when we're giving the fields a rest. We put in some buckwheat and we still see a return from selling that honey. I think it's a really good system. And just for the record, when you mix sunflower and buckwheat honey, it tastes really good. People really like it. Flax is another option. Honeybees really do enjoy visiting flax as well. And then, of course, if you can manage sunflowers, as I've kind of experienced, they're a bit more of a trickier crop to grow. But clover, buckwheat, and flax tend to be really good. Okay.
2016 was an exceptionally dry year for us on our farm. The beekeeper placed his hives, and within 2 days, a neighbor who had a fish pond with goldfish in it experienced 3 deaths of the fish. Is there any correlation with that and the bees?
Okay, so I'm just gonna reiterate the question because it was a bit choppy there. So your neighbor had a fish pond and it was really dry. And did I hear correctly that the fish, did they perish? What happened there?
3 of the fish died. And was there a correlation between the placement of the hive near to the water and the fish dying?
The only thing that I can really think of is that there's no question that the bees were actually probably going to that fish pond for water. Again, as I said, like water was, I heard nightmare stories from 2016 about beehives just overheating and dying, which is really bad. It's heartbreaking. But so the one thing I could, this may be a stretch, but there's almost 100% guarantee that the bees were visiting the fish pond for water. And I guess I'm just going to say that maybe the fish went and maybe ate too many of those honeybees and maybe, I don't know, died from being stung. I've never heard of this before. What I do know is that bees love saltwater pools. So if you have a neighbor with a saltwater pool, the bees are definitely going to be going to that one. But as for fish eating bees and dying, I don't know. That's a very good question. It's a mystery for Sherlock Holmes.
Any other questions for Janine? One at the back, hang on, Janine. Phil's gotta go all the way to the back. You're in
I just want to mention just quickly that Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, actually, when he decided to retire Sherlock Holmes, he retired him to become a beekeeper, which was really cool.
Yeah, my question is, given the current conditions for bees, is it possible to get by without treating bees for mites? Is that at all possible, or is it just a pipe dream?
Okay, so again, I'm sorry, the connection's a little poor. Is it possible to, Lori, would you be able to maybe say a little closer with the question?
Get along without treating for the mites.
Right, okay. That again is, it depends on what kind of camp you come from. So I actually had the pleasure of observing a feral beehive actually that was living in a log on my dad's farm. And these bees, I don't even know, I came across them and the bees were already actually living in the log. So I have no idea how long they'd been living in the wild in this log for, but I observed them for 3 years. And I didn't treat them, and they survived just fine. They swarmed every year, they were managing. And I remember looking at the front entrance of the log, and I could see that the bees were kicking the mites out themselves. So I mention that because bees actually practice this thing called hygienic behavior. And quite literally, when a bee feels a mite on its back, it has learned to actually take the mite off of its back and bite it, like thereby breaking its little protective shell, and then they drop the mite, and the mite subsequently dies. So it's kind of like, will you let the bees run their course and let their genetics and their behaviors actually save them? Because that's essentially what nature does allow for. It's kind of the sink or swim sort of attitude. But then there is a lot of controversy where, as a beekeeper, you are responsible for maintaining and controlling, diseases before there's an outbreak. So this is the other side of the camp, where if you are a beekeeper and you're just kind of letting the mites run wild, and the weaker ones die and the stronger ones survive, the opinion is that you actually are perpetuating the problem by not actually controlling the mite population. Personally speaking, this may or may not be the right thing to do, but I believe it is. I believe that a proper the bees being able to access proper nutrition, especially, a wide array of plants from the Labiatae family. So that's like your mints and your lavenders and your sages. Those are very, very, very medicinal. And there's a lot of evidence now that bees actually, they self-medicate. They actually know which nectar is medicinal and which types of pollen they actually need at certain times. So bees are capable of self-medicating, and there is a recent product. It's called Thymovar, and it's made out of thyme, and it's a thyme oil extract that's then been used in the hives against varroa mite, and it actually shows to be really, really, really effective. One of the studies that I was working on at the University of Guelph also showed that clove oil was very effective, and actually the active compound in garlic, which is called allicin powder, was really, really effective for combating the varroa mite as well. So there are natural options, and the harsh acaricides, so like a miticide, the harsh miticides really only drive further drug resistance. So there has been a lot of resistance shown to the common treatment called Apivar, and it really has been shown not to work in very many hives much at all.
Yeah. We have another question right here, so just bear with us. Here it comes.
And how would you get the thyme oil, clove oil, and garlic into the system, into the beekeeping system?
So that's actually one of I would just love to be able to do this research project myself to see if the thyme oil, so say like there's the active compounds in thyme oil, the essential oil of thyme, whether or not there is the same active compounds in nectar produced by the thyme flower. I believe, I have faith that it actually would be the same. It would be almost the same thing to see if, like, say you would let some of your wild garlic go to seed, and then the bees would then be able to visit garlic flowers, thereby perhaps actually accessing allicin on their own. So essentially, to answer your question, Thymovar, so like the thyme oil, is actually manufactured now, unfortunately. So it comes in these strips that you buy from beekeeping stores. So it's not necessarily like you can, take a file folder and drop a bunch of thyme oil on it and then put it in your hive. It would need to volatilize, like it would need to evaporate at a proper rate so you don't cause damage to the bees as well. So I don't know, I'm a proponent of actually being able to give the bees access to the medicine that they need, so growing thyme and growing garlic and then letting that take its natural course. Anyway.
We've got another question over here.
Just a quick one, wondering whether the bees have a preferential to like standing water in wetlands, or do they like running water, creeks or rivers?
Okay, so standing water versus like running water, I've seen bees just help themselves to both. I think the important part is whether or not bees can actually land and drink without drowning. So I've seen some people, they set out margarine containers or even like large kiddie pools for their beehives if they don't have water on site, but they quite often forget to, say, put in rocks or a board or something that maybe even floats. So the bees need to be able to land on it because they have to perch and then feed. So yeah, I have a bird feeder out here that I keep, a bird bath, and I have a couple rocks in it, and I get to watch the bees land and drink. So I think for bees, honestly, water is water. I've seen them drink from a really kind of warm, fetid kiddie pool, but they still need water, I suppose. But a fast-flowing river, they would still need to probably go somewhere a little bit quieter so that they could land and drink.
Okay, we've got our last question coming up. Janine, you've done a great job thus far, and we'll put the last question to Peter.
Janine, yes, one thing I want to tell you, we had an onion and garlic patch last year that stayed this year and when both went to seed, and I never have seen as many honeybees around these onion and garlic plants that were in seed. So it's amazing. So, but my question really is about how does a hive react to resist, or how healthy is it going to be if you feed it sugar water over the winter, if it keeps their own honey to survive the winter on? Is there any difference in bee health?
Okay, that is an amazing question. It's a really great way to end the discussion as well. So again, I like to tinker myself, and I've done my own assay, trying in an attempt to actually answer this question. So what honey is, essentially, bees store honey to have something to survive on because they hibernate during the winter. But when a bee hibernates, they actually still have to shiver to keep warm. And so that act of shivering is fueled by the fact that they're eating honey. And then, oddly enough, too, when it's really, really cold out, the bees actually not only have to eat the honey, but they actually have to thaw it first because they cluster. So bees, during the winter, they're in a big cluster and they have to move from frame to frame. And if they don't move across the frame fast enough and actually melt or thaw the next day's, say, supply of honey, then they actually run the risk of starving to death. So when you're overwintering your bees, you have to make sure that they are wall to wall with honey, because if they don't have, say if there's one frame that has a gap in the middle, and if it's really, really cold, it's like crossing the Sahara Desert for them. They would probably just basically starve and die. So back to your question, I have actually been leaving a honey super on my hives every winter, and I have actually not experienced any losses yet. I may have just been lucky. My bees are really sheltered from the winter winds, but this is why I maybe started explaining why bees have so many honey stores and like why they store it. You give them what they need, and I honestly believe that some beekeepers are taking way too much than they should, especially if they need to supplement with something like sugar water. Sugar water does not have the same type of energy profile, so it doesn't have the right kinds of fructose and glucose, let alone any protein. So I guess I gotta say, like, there are pollen grains in honey. When you eat honey, there's also the pollen grains in that honey, and pollen is actually the bee's protein. And I would just implore anyone to try to survive their winter without protein, because that's what beekeepers are giving their bees to survive on, is sugar water, which is completely devoid of protein. So I strongly encourage people, if they can spare it, and I'm pretty sure they can, because I don't think they need to take all of the honey away from the bees, is that they could consider maybe next year leaving a honey super on for the bees to survive.
That's wonderful, Janine. Any parting words before we say goodbye?
Thank you, everyone, for your great questions.
Thank you, Janine. We really appreciate it.